All right, so about a week or so ago, I dug up a video from the vaults. Well, not exactly from the vaults, so a few months old, that started with an analysis of a debate between Gutsick Gibbon and our very own Rebecca. Rebecca took a little break. It looks like she's back in action, so good, good, good. Now, there's a reason why I wanted to post that video, because it was a clear delineation or a clear example of a phenomena that is really common in the atheist community. Again, I'm not necessarily saying Gutsick Gibbon did this, but it's a really good way to understand a common phenomenon. There's really only one type of atheist argument. It is what I call the Sleight-of-Hand school of Counter-Apologetics. There's one main type of atheist argumentation, and the debate between Gutsick Gibbon and Rebecca is an easy way to understand it. Now, again, I don't know this for a fact because I didn't really investigate Gutsick Gibbon's channel, but she spends a lot of time on her channel debunking young earth creationism. So I'm not saying she necessarily does this, but this is how it works. They call it I'm calling it the Sleight-of-Hand school of Counter-Apologetics. It is, generally speaking, the only type of atheist argument in town. And it works like this. Rebecca, our young friend Rebecca, is in a debate. She's a young earth creationist. Yeah, I didn't know she was a young earth creationist either. I didn't get it either, but whatever. You know, it's to each their own. So, young earth creation is a position that is very easily debunked. Why? Because almost all of the evidence suggests that the earth is billions of years old. So there's some, I guess, some evidence for young earth creation. I didn't really bother to watch that much of the debate. I don't really follow the young earth creationists all that closely. Why? Because the evidence suggests that they are mistaken. So it's a really easy debate for an atheist to win. Now, what Gutsick Gibbon, if she were one of the other atheists, I'm not saying she does this, but if she were almost any other atheist in town, any other evangelical atheist, this is exactly what she'd do. She'd have a debate where she starts showing the evidence against young earth creationism, and a whole bunch of atheists watch the channel, and they truck in inferences that don't automatically follow or don't automatically apply. So they are watching ostensibly somebody get shown that young earth creationism is more than likely a false position based on the evidence. And instead of going, look, young earth creationism is false, which automatically follows and logically applies, and you can infer that from the debate. If someone is losing a debate really badly based on the evidence about young earth creationism, you can automatically infer, well, that probably means that young earth creationism isn't that well evidence of a position, and maybe I shouldn't hold to it. By the way, I'm not a young earth creationist for that reason. But what the atheists normally do, not being satisfied with that, is they go, look, Rebecca is losing this debate. Rebecca's a Christian. Ergo, Christianity is false. Ergo, God does not exist. They truck in inferences that don't automatically follow or logically apply. I'm calling it the Sleight-of-Hand school of Counter-Apologetics. If you actually investigate almost every atheist argument, almost every single solitary atheist argument, and all of the ones that they always say are good arguments, fall under this category. What does debunking young earth creationism have to do with the ontological status of God? Zero. Not one iota of an ounce. Absolutely nothing. Therefore, you can't infer. And what does it have to do with Christianity in general? Again, zero. I'm a Christian. I'm not a young earth creationist at all. Why? Boy, because I just said, most of the evidence seems to suggest that the earth is billions of years old. Some of the other more fundamentalist positions, I think, are a lot more plausible than young earth creationism. Young earth creationism, I give very, very little credence to. Why Rebecca's a young earth creationist? I don't know. Rebecca's actually a really intelligent person. So it wouldn't surprise me if she abandons these. She is. She's actually pretty smart. I find her intelligent. She's nice. She's cool. She has a really good channel. Don't say it's better than my channel. Better than your channel, Craig. All right, shut up. Nobody asked. Thank you for offering that. Nobody asked. A lot better than your channel, Craig. No, it isn't. But the main reason for this video is, ostensibly, what are we in a debate with an atheist about? God, the ontological status of the deity. If you are an atheist, you do not believe that God exists. I just lack a belief, or you lack a belief that God exists. One or the other. You believe that God does not exist. One of those. But the only thing actually under discussion is the ontological status of God. If it is nothing to do with the ontological status of God, guess what? Guess what? Then it has nothing to do with the ontological status of God. Hate to point out the obvious, but almost every atheist argument is something that, if you actually analyze, has very little to do with the ontological status of God. If you are a Christian, the reason why this is pretty important, because first of all, it shows that almost routinely they're really bad at critical thinking. Why? Critical thinking, number one. Critical thinking skills, number one. Does this have anything to do with what I'm saying it has to do with? If the answer is no, then you shouldn't be presenting it as such. Again, I'm not saying Gutsick Gibbon is presenting that as an argument against God, but it wouldn't surprise me if she does. Why? Almost every other atheist does. So, for example, I brought up rationality rules in one of my last videos. When he was saying, we have really good justifications, we have really good arguments for atheism. Again, I didn't put these arguments in his mouth. He said, not me. He said, these are the 5 that he listed, which means these are the 5 that he generally thinks are the best. And of the 5, not a single one of them has anything to do with the ontological status of God, except for one a little bit. He said, the erythroprobe dilemma. That's terrible overall, but has nothing to do with the ontological status of God. Said, the problem of evil. That's the only one that it can be fashioned into an argument against ontology, but generally it's not. It is more plausibly and more precisely an argument about the character of God. If God is good, why is he allowing these poor kids to starve all the time in Africa? And all the time. They're starving all the time in Africa. God just doesn't seem to care. He must not be good. The good God would have dealt with that a long time ago. That's the main argument from, what's-her-face on Atheist Experience, the one who left. That used to be her main argument. If I were a good God, I wouldn't allow, if I were God, I'd be a good God, and I wouldn't allow all these terrible things to like kids to get raped and yada yada. It's generally speaking an argument against the character of God. It can be fashioned into a bit of an argument against an ontology, but it's harder to do such. But the other 4 that he mentioned have nothing to do with ontology. He said contradictions in the Bible. Kidding? That's got literally nothing to do with the ontological status of God. Again, it's got something to do if you think the Bible is inerrant, sure. But that is not the ontological status of God. You've got to pay attention. If you are a Christian and atheists have gotten inside your head and rattled your cage, pay attention to what's actually rattling your cage and bring it out in the cold light of day and examine it. And go, this challenging question that's keeping me up at night, oh my God, it's game changing. Does it have anything to do with the actual ontological status of God? And line it up, write it down on a piece of paper and put it next to God exists. And see if they correspond to each other. Can God exist and this thing be true at the exact same time? 99 times out of 100, the answer will be yes. Can God exist? And can there be contradictions in the Bible at the exact same time? Yes. And if you are one of these people who think the Bible is without error, again, that's a lot more plausible to me than young earth creationism. 15 to 20%, I think maybe. But there are a bunch of scriptures in there that are really hard to reconcile. And as I pointed out 1,000 times over already, you are going to lose that debate. And when you lose that debate, why? Because there's only 2 ways that debate goes. It looks like you, the Christian, are either not clearly acknowledging what the text says, or not clearly acknowledging or minimizing atrocities. In the case of usually it's the Old Testament atrocities. Okay, so you're going to lose that debate. Why? Because they can just, if you have a really good justification for this particular one, they're just going to move to another one. And it's going to look eventually like you're tap dancing. And then they're going to do what? They're going to truck in inferences that don't apply. Look, this guy's tap dancing when asked to address the challenging scriptures in the Old Testament. Therefore, Christianity is false. Doesn't have anything to do with it. Therefore, God does not exist. See how it works? If you are, the reason why I brought this up is it's important if you're a Christian and you think you're struggling with all these groundbreaking, challenging questions that keep me up at night. Take it out in the cold light of day and examine it. And does it have anything to do with the ontological status of God? I almost routinely guarantee you the answer will be no. Why? Because almost none of them do. So going back to the ones that rationality rules, this is what he cited. I didn't cite them. He did. As the strongest justifications for atheism. And what's interesting about them, none of them are justification for atheism at all. They have nothing to do with the ontological status of God. Okay, arithmetic I already said. Contradiction in the scriptures, I already said. Problem of evil, I already said. Then he said problem of hell. Nothing to do with the ontological status of God. You know, you can think, wow, hell is really unfair. Again, that's about the character of God. Is he going to sentence a whole bunch of people to hell just for not believing in Jesus Christ as the only Son of God? Something like that. It's not a question. It's a question of, is God fair and just and right and true? It's not a question of, look, he doesn't exist. Why? Because this version of God, this Christian iteration of God doesn't seem fair or right or just or true. Then that Christian iteration of God, that Christian theological construct may not be true. And if probably why I don't necessarily hold to it. Do you get it? I'll go into that again in a second. The last one that he cited, what did I say? Ontological, what did I say? Rithipro dilemma, problem of evil, problem of hell. Oh, the weak evidence for the resurrection. You know, debatable. Weak evidence, as I pointed out, the argument for the resurrection isn't our best argument. It's not our strongest argument. Why? Because the resurrection is the centerpiece, miracle of all Christianity. And to the atheist, to the committed naturalist, you know, the more plausible explanation, even if it's an implausible explanation, which a lot of their explanations are, even if it's an implausible explanation, it's going to seem 100 times more plausible to somebody who doesn't believe in supernatural occurrences at all. They tell you right from the start, extraordinary claim, it requires extraordinary evidence. In other words, the burden of proof for you is so high, you got to totally rock my world. You got to shatter everything about my preconceived notions about what's possible in the world in order for me to believe in a resurrection. But again, nothing to do with the ontological status of God. God could exist and he could not resurrect people, not have resurrected somebody. It has something to do with Christianity for sure. But these are justifications, in his words, for atheism. Do you see how they're not? They're not. And almost every atheist argument operates along these lines. Old Testament slavery, don't even get me started. That's one of their favorite ones. What's it got to do with the ontological status of God? Literally zero. And some Christians are sweating that one out at night. Oh my God, I can't believe the Old Testament is endorsing slavery. A slave-holding society writes a holy book. And guess what? They conveniently forget to mention God is against slavery. Gee, wow, it's so surprising. I can't believe that happened. They conveniently forget to leave that out. I mean, that's not all that surprising, guys. It's really not. It should never be an argument at all. Why? Because atheists say they're good critical thinkers. That's lousy critical thinking skills. They just want to gotcha the Christians. And it works. The reason why the atheists were successful originally, again, I've said this before, it's worth repeating. Because when they got to this space, they arrived en masse. And they had a big, fat, easy target fundamentalist Christians. Why? Because they hold to some of these positions that are really hard to defend come hell or high water. I'm not saying the positions are true, and I'm not saying the positions are false. I'm saying they're really hard to defend, which is evidence that they may be false. Okay, in the case of young earth creationism, I'm pretty sure it ain't so. Why? Because all of the evidence suggests otherwise, which makes it impossible to defend in the public sphere. If you're a young earth creationist, that's fine with me. Keep it to yourself. Why? Because you can't defend it. That's why. And they're going to win. And when they win, they're going to pretend that it's an argument in favor of atheism when it isn't. That it's an argument against ontology when it isn't. They're going to truck in inferences that don't apply. Why do they do that when they call themselves critical thinkers? Because they aren't very good at critical thinkers. They aren't good at it. Jonathan M.S. Pierce, and this is like a pretty mainstream atheist, was on Myth Vision podcast, blowing my mind with the weakness of his argumentation and his lack of critical thinking skills. Wrote a book, 30 Arguments Against the Existence of God. I literally watched it for 5 minutes. It was like, you got to be kidding. You have to be kidding. Why? Because this has nothing to do with ontology, dude. Starts arguing with the problem of hell. There's a Hindu somewhere, and he's going to go to hell for not believing in God. Meanwhile, nobody ever told him the gospel. That's not fair. Yeah, that's right. That's not fair. Doesn't seem fair to me either. That's why I don't think that's how it goes down. You can't do that, Craig. Yeah, I can. Watch me. Watch me. You can't just think that, Craig. That's why I don't believe that. It's not an argument against ontology. It's a decent argument against a certain iteration of Christianity, a certain Christian theological construct that may be held to by a lot of Christians. Irrelevant. Why? Because it's not an argument against an ontology. Really think about what you're saying. Does that have anything to do with the ontological status of God? No. Can God exist and that the idea that, God sentences a Hindu to hell who never heard the gospel for not having heard the gospel be false? Yes. Therefore, it has nothing to do with ontology. And I don't think that's how it goes down. And actually, this is just worth hearing for, I think Ron already knows this. A couple people already know this. In Eastern Orthodox, and no, I'm not turning into Eastern Orthodox, but they actually have some of the church fathers have some really good theological ideas. And some of the videos that they put out on the topic are worth getting into. Why? Because they do some actually really good explaining of this stuff. There's a really good one about damnation in terms of, or not damnation, but rather God's judgment. And it actually makes complete sense to me, and it's very close to what I think is probably the case. Say Christ's likeness is what you're going to be judged on, whether you heard the gospel or not. So were you a merciful, compassionate human being? Were you decent to your kids? Were you decent to the people around you? That's ultimately what everybody's going to be judged on. That makes complete and utter sense to me. You're going to be judged on your behavior, not what propositions of Christianity did you privately believe, because that just doesn't make any sense. You're going to be judged on your moral actions, the deeds you committed in the body. Now, I'm not saying that's case closed true. I'm just saying that's the thing that makes the most sense to me. Ergo, the idea that a Hindu goes to hell, let's think of a decent Hindu who's, a really nice guy helping people out, and God sentences to hell just because he never heard the gospel. That seems unfair, correct? That's why I don't think that's how it goes down. To me, the most plausible thing that God is going to judge that person on, and there's some scriptural justification for this, by the way. Paul, the Apostle Paul, heard of him? That guy's pretty important in the Bible, right? He said, I was shown mercy because I acted in ignorance. Now, when he was talking about him being shown mercy, he wasn't just somebody who didn't believe in Jesus. He was someone who was actively trying to kill Christians, which the last time I checked, morally speaking, is pretty darn bad, correct? Yeah, it's pretty bad, Craig. And he was shown mercy. Why? Because he acted in ignorance. And the same Bible says God is no respecter of persons. So the Hindu is acting in ignorance, raising his family, being a decent, hardworking human being, but he's never heard the gospel. Do you really think God's going to sentence him to hell for not having heard what God didn't provide to his ears? No, of course not. I don't. I'm not saying of course not, but I don't. That's why it's a terrible argument against the existence of God. Jonathan M.S. Pierce, why is he presenting it as such? Bad at critical thinking, or he's raised fundamentalist? When you raise fundamentalists, it warps your brain. Emerson Green is a really smart guy, and he was listening to him, and he didn't really challenge it either. He did offer, not every Christian believes this, but he goes, well, most Christians do, as if that settles it. Oh, most Christians do, therefore it's an argument against God. No, it's not. It's an argument against a certain theological construct of Christianity. And the only reason you think it would be an argument against God is either A, you're trying to scam everybody, or B, you're lousy at critical thinking. Take your pick. Take your pick. But examine every single atheist argument you've ever heard. That's a big claim, Craig. Check it out. Because almost all of them operate this way. That's why I posted the video. It's really easy to understand in the case of Gutsick Gibbon, but almost every atheist argument out there operates under the same paradigm. They aren't arguments against ontology at all. They even get really upset if you say, argue against ontology, prove that God does not exist. You're switching the burden of proof. You're switching the burden of proof, Craig. You're the one making a positive claim, Craig. That's what they say. That's what they'll say. That's fine. I'm trying to make a positive claim. I'm trying to evidence the proposition that God exists. I got no issue with being assigned the burden of proof. But don't turn around and present all these half-baked, crock of crap arguments and say they're arguments against the existence of God, when in fact they are not. Why? Because they have nothing to do with the ontological status of the deity. And so many atheists, mostly these are debate me bro atheists, but sometimes a Myth Vision podcast, as far as I'm concerned, is a mainstream program. And Jonathan M.S. Pierce is a mainstream atheist, and he presented that on the program, and not a single person challenged it. Not a single. It was like I was the only one who noticed. Hey, wait a minute, dude. This got nothing to do with anything. Hello, sorry. Go rewrite the book. Why? Because this is garbage. I'm the only one who noticed. The only one who noticed. That's really pretty bad. That's really pretty bad. Why? Because lousy critical thinkers in the atheist community. Generally, they're just as bad at critical thinking as when they were Christians. If Aaron Ross said it, it's probably true. That's the paradigm they use now. Oh, it's got to be right. Why? Dillahunty said it. Oh, that settles it. It's said by Dillahunty, Craig. Oh, never mind. Then it's got to be true. You like to think that they're bringing a little bit more to the table in terms of critical thinking than that, but honestly, a huge chunk of them aren't. I promise. I promise. Again, I'll say it again. I say it every time. You got your smart atheists. I'm not talking about them. I'm talking about the dummy atheists, but that's a big chunk. Myth Vision Podcast is a mainstream atheist product, correct? I think it's got like 30,000, 50,000, some thousand amounts of subscribers, a lot more than I do. And not a single person challenged, hey, wait a minute, what? This is misleading. Why not? Because atheists just swallow this stuff whole hog. Don't examine it. If you're an atheist, wake up. Examine what you're presenting as an argument against ontology. Why? Because it almost routinely isn't. I'll bring it up again. So atheists are so used to making these half-baked arguments that they can't even process it accurately. In order for something to count as an argument against God, it has to be evidence against the ontological status itself. Not evidence. You can say, this helps me think that Christianity is false. Fine. Acceptable. It could be an argument against an iteration of Christianity. Sure. I accept that. That's not an argument against God. It's an argument against a certain type of theological construct. Think it through clearly, use critical thinking, and analyze the difference. Because this is routine. This is routine. When the guy says people have said they should do what's it called? The believers, what's the thing with John Loftus with the, put yourself outside the shoes and you pretend that you're not the Christian. Oh God, I forget the name of it. I can't think of it offhand. It's same paradigm. He said, pretend that you're not a Christian and analyze what you actually believe. But then he jumps immediately to, what is it? Something I forget. I don't remember it offhand. But it's same. Almost every atheist argument goes on this paradigm. Almost every single solitary one. There is very, very, very few to none that work any other way. There are the highbrow arguments from the smart set. You got your case for naturalism, Paul Draper's case for naturalism. You got your, the ones that the real atheology crew favors. And you got those arguments are decent in terms of well thought out philosophical constructs and conversation pieces. Okay? Those arguments are decent. And they're presented as probabilistic in nature, giving you a little bit more to think. And they usually are presented correctly in terms of this is a way to think Christianity itself is not true. They're not usually presented as argument in favor of naturalism or an argument in favor of, the underlying belief system. Those aren't usually as flawed. Other than that, the rest of them are absolutely terrible. Honestly, absolutely terrible, almost routinely, round the boards. Because it's the most common type of atheist argument is the Sleight-Of-Hand school of Counter-Apologetics. It is by far the most common type of argument. As I said, rationality rules. That's a pretty big channel, right? That's mainstream, 300,000 or so subscribers. He said, these are my justifications for atheism, which means these are my justifications for me not believing in God. And not a single one of them has anything to do with the ontological status of God at all. Atheists have cooked their brains. They've gotten so used to thinking in terms of arguments that they don't really process this out correctly. I've seen this happen 1,000 times. Like I told you in one of my last videos when I was trying to talk about this with reality relief belief. He couldn't even process what I was saying. What I was saying was very simple. Doesn't matter. This was the argument. They can't all be right, that they can all be wrong. Okay, that one's got a flaw too. Two flaws. First of all, there's a lot of overlapping themes, and the first thing you notice if you study comparative religion, not as an atheist where you're trying to gotcha everybody, but just as an honest human being, is that there's a lot of overlapping themes. You don't believe me? Go look at Joseph Campbell, Power of Myth. That's the whole point. That's the whole point. And that was a mainstream thing. That was when I was in college. A lot of people were into that. I read it then. The whole point of it, comparative religion, which is what is so interesting about all these different mythologies and all these different faith traditions, is how much they have in common. That's the whole point of it. And that was a really successful mainstream comparative religion product. Jordan Peterson has been heavily influenced by that. And that was the point of it. That these different faith traditions from all over the world have these themes in common. Isn't that interesting? Meanwhile, the atheists give you this misleading gotcha phrase, they can't all be right, but they can all be wrong, as if that isn't true when in fact it is true. But to further analyze, they can't all be right, but they can all be wrong, it is irrelevant. What people actually believe, and this was the point I was making to Relief Belief, and he couldn't process the point. Started accusing me of being dumb, because he couldn't process the point. Why couldn't he process the point? Because he'd been so used to using gimmicky fake arguments for so long that he couldn't think clearly on the topic. Promise, that's why. Couldn't even process what I was saying. So the only argument I was making is, even if there were all these contradictory ideas about God, that's irrelevant. Why? Because belief is irrelevant to ontology. It is irrelevant to ontological status. There can be an elephant in a parking lot, and people on the other side of the hill who heard all these varying reports about the elephant chained to a parking lot. Does any of their reports or their beliefs or what they heard have anything to do with the reality of whether the elephant is in fact there? No. Is that hard to understand? No. It's easy to understand. It's impossible to understand if you've trained yourself to only think of Christianity as with the debunked sausage factory mind, with pretzel logic where you're just trying to debunk. So he starts arguing with me, no, Christians believe X. I said, okay, right there, flaw. Has nothing to do with what Christians believe. The ontological status of God could be completely not tethered to Christian beliefs at all. I think they are, but they could easily not be. Do you see what I'm saying? And then I used a really, really good analogy that I think describes it perfectly based in actual fact. When the Titanic sank, I've said it before, but it's worth repeating, just to underscore the obvious. When the Titanic sank, there was a whole group of people who watched it sink with their own eyes. So you have an actual event, an actual occurrence, and they couldn't decide amongst themselves whether the boat split in two before it sank or just shot up straight in the water and sank. Now, the only point I'm making is that their indecision, their not being clear on what actually happened, does not affect the ontological status of what actually happened at all. The boat did one or the other, irrespective of what they think they saw. Correct? Correct. Do you get it? You should. Do you get it? You should. It's not that complicated. It's not that hard to understand. The boat did one of the two things. It either went straight up in the air and went down, or went straight up in the air, split in two, then went down. And the people who actually watched it happen couldn't decide which had happened. Some people thought it went straight up in the air and sank. Some people thought it split in two. The only point I'm making, it doesn't matter which was the majority either. That's one thing an atheist will go, well, common sense says if 80% of them think, no, common sense doesn't say that at all. There's nothing to do. What they think they saw has nothing to do with what actually happened. That's what common sense tells you. It is irrelevant, what? To the actual fact. One of those two things happened. And people saw it differently who actually saw it with their own eyes. Belief is irrelevant to what? Ontological status of a thing. Period. Which means there could be 50 billion different versions of what God is or is not. And it doesn't affect the ontological status of God one iota. God could be really hard to know and hard to understand, just like the Christian Bible says. It even says it about believers. Now we see through a glass darkly, then face to face. Which means even we Christian believers who study the scriptures and pray all the time, see through a glass darkly, barely understand this stuff. So the Bible says quite clearly. So you would expect what? A whole bunch of confusion. Now an atheist is going to spin that into, well, I'd expect that a God would, if he really wanted us to know, would make it easier to understand. No, not necessarily. The Bible says otherwise. It says, surely you are your God who hides his face and then says it is the glory of God to conceal a matter. It is the glory of kings to seek it out. So the Bible says clearly, that ain't so. That is not on God's agenda to make himself easy to understand. It is something to reward the people who are diligent. He is a rewarder of those who diligently seek his face. To the people who want to remain clueless about his operations in the world, he says, be my guest. I don't care. Now, the only reason that would be an issue is if you think your eternal destiny hangs on it. And I get that a lot of Christians think that. I'm not necessarily sure that it does. What I think your eternal destiny hangs on is, are you a halfway decent human being? Are you moral, good, and upright? Doesn't make any sense to me that God would, sentence a decent human being to hell just for not believing in him. So I don't necessarily think that that's the case. There could be circumstances I'm not aware of that person could be a total fraud and kind of, there's a lot. They could be very complicit. They could be fraudulent. I'm just saying that doesn't make complete sense to me. What makes sense to me is people are going to be judged on the deeds in their body. Are they moral? Are they decent? Are they kind? Are they upright? Are they good human beings? That's what they're going to be judged on. And if you're an atheist and you're thinking, oh, easy. No, not necessarily. No, don't be so sure. Oh, easy, I got it nailed. No, I wouldn't say, well, all right, fine. Maybe you do. Maybe you do. So, do you get it? There's a reason why I brought that old chestnut of a debate up. Why? Because it really underscores the obvious. Almost every atheist argument you will ever see, analyze. The highbrow atheists use different arguments, and their arguments are good and interesting. But every other argument by the gimmicky rest of the group, and I'm talking even mainstream atheists, almost every argument you'll hear on Atheist Experience, Sleight-Of-Hand school of Counter-Apologetics. Matt Dillahunty is a pro at it. He usually how he works, why he wins every debate, is he maneuvers people. Doesn't matter what they'll call up and say, how do you get your morals if you don't believe in God? And he'll maneuver them to Old Testament slavery and then start cleaning their clock on that. He'll redefine the parameters of the debate as they are debating, so that the person starts out thinking they're talking about this and they wind up talking about that and never notice that it happened. Why? Because he's on terra firma with that. That's why he does it. That's manipulative, Craig, yeah. yeah, pretty much. Really manipulative, but he does it well. Then nobody catches him. I mean, I caught him, but nobody else seems to catch him. Atheists should have caught him a long time ago. If you're great critical thinkers, you should have noticed that. There's a lot of people who notice that. Some atheists notice that. I get a lot of people telling me in private, things about Matt Dillahunty's that they aren't crazy about, and they don't like his way of debating people, particularly when he used to be on the Atheist Experience. I get a lot of people telling me that, and they see it. There's a lot of atheists who do get this. I'm not saying that they're all imbeciles who terrible critical thinking, but the atheists who do get this will also tell me a lot of the people in the atheist community are what? Imbeciles with terrible critical thinking. They'll tell me straight up. They got nothing to hide. They're honest. They got nothing to hide. I'm not going to judge them based on the imbecility of the rest of the group. I judge them based on how they act towards me. And I like those people. Almost always. I always think they're cool. Won't mention any of their names. Everyone knows basically who I'm talking about, more or less. The only one who's joined the crew is Rev and Fidel. He's honorary member of the Answers from Reason crew. He's like them, pretty much the same type of person. Same thing, honest person, sees things for as they are, not as he wishes they were. That's the difference. I don't think the Answers from Reason crew are particularly brilliant, geniuses. I think it's more a character thing. They try to see things as they actually are rather than how they wish them to be, and they don't pimp out atheist arguments that are terrible. They don't. A lot of other atheists do. Why? Because they're playing teams. And they judge the argument based on how many fake points for atheism it can score. And the reason why these arguments are popular is because they score a lot of fake points for atheism, particularly the Old Testament atrocities argument. Used to be the most popular one in town. Why? Because it's easy to score a lot of fake points, especially if you're debating a fundamentalist, because he won't let go of it. He'll die on that hillside. He won't. And even if it's not a fundamentalist, they have to frame the argument correctly. If they wind up hand-wringing over the atrocities in the Old Testament, it doesn't serve us. That's what Randall Rouser does. He rounds up hand-wringing over it, like, oh my God, there's so many atrocities in the Old Testament. Who cares? I didn't write the Bible, neither did you. Let it go. There's good moral instruction in the Old Testament. Yeah, there is. And God is also kind. God is mean and vindictive and fiery in the Old Testament, but he's also kind, loving, compassionate. There's tons of examples of God of the Old Testament being loving, kind, compassionate. Love your neighbor as yourself is from Leviticus. from Leviticus. It's restated in the New Testament, but it's from Leviticus. And that's like, one of the trippiest Old Testament books there is. So the idea that the God of the Old Testament is just fiery and ornery and terrible is wildly overrated. It's propaganda. It's junk. To a large degree, it's junk. It's true in certain times, sure. But it's also not true, even in the Old Testament. You don't have to wait till Jesus till you get the loving, kind, compassionate God. It's all in the Psalms. It's all in Isaiah. It's all through the Old Testament. So that's not true either. So anyways, rambling at this point. I think everybody understands the point of the video. And if you are a Christian struggling with your faith, this is very important. Stop struggling. Ask yourself a really important question. Does this thing that's keeping me up at night and rattling my cage and getting inside my head, the atheists have gotten in your head, and you let that happen? Why? Because you're not paying attention. First of all, you believe them when they say they're smarter and more scientifically literate than we are. No, they aren't. Nope. No. You bought that one hook, line, and sinker. Why? Because you ain't too sharp. Because you're intellectually insecure and you ain't too bright. Let's just be perfectly honest. Why? Because it's pretty obvious. There are smart atheists, but there are just as many dummies in their squad as every other squad on earth. There are. Go poke around, you don't believe me. There are. Ask the smart atheists. They'll tell you. Yeah, there are. They'll tell you straight up. Yeah, there are. We're embarrassed by them. I know. It's fine. I'm embarrassed by some Christians too. It doesn't matter. But the point is, if you are a Christian struggling with your faith, take out the thing that they're rattling your cage with and ask yourself a really important question. An analytic question. Use critical thinking. Is this relevant to the ontological status of God? 99 times out of 100, the answer will be no. And if you're a raised fundamentalist, you can deconstruct without deconverting. You can go, okay, the earth probably isn't 6,000 years old. Why? Because all the evidence suggests otherwise. But that doesn't mean, nor does it even imply, nor is it even a little bit of evidence in favor of the proposition God does not exist. Doesn't mean any of that. If you want to stay young earth creationist, fine with me. Be a young earth creationist. Don't care. Don't care if you're an atheist either. Stay an atheist. Don't care. I'm just making my videos. I don't care. I don't care what you believe. I care how you act towards me. And if a lot of atheists are cool to me, I like them. Period. I do. I like them. I get along with some bunch of atheists really well. Why? Because they're nice. They're cool. Got no issue with them. They can believe whatever they want. I think they're mistaken. And I think I'd crush them in a debate. Crush them. But, if you're a young earth creationist, fine with me. Don't debate it in public. Why? Because the position is indefensible. You can believe it privately as much as you want. But the position is indefensible. That's why I don't hold to it. Why? Because there's no evidence suggests otherwise. It's that simple. The atheist paradigm of reality, that I want to believe, I proportion my confidence to the evidence presented, is a good one. You can take that one home. Take that out of the atheist community and use it in your own life. I proportion my confidence to the evidence presented. And, if you are struggling with Christianity because of atheists have got inside your head, see if it actually corresponds to the ontological status of God. 99 times out of 100, the answer will be no. The answer will be no. You are hand-wringing over nothing. So there you have it, kids. Another slam dunk of a video, if I do say so myself. That is all for now. Mass is over. Go in peace.